Israel has issued an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister. It's one of several big, fast-moving stories this week. So we've decided to do something a little bit different for our Trumpet World Week in Review show. We're going to cover this week's Middle East news now, live with my colleague Mihailo Zekic, who focuses on watching the Middle East. We'll get to the rest later, perhaps with another live show tomorrow. And then we'll stitch that together, and that will be our cutting-edge Week in Review program. That way we can give you up-to-the-minute news with these fast-paced events. So without further ado, we can cue the stinger and get going on this week's Trumpet World. What a week it has been. The first use of an intercontinental ballistic missile in war. We were getting ready to go with that as our main story for the Trumpet World Week in Review. Then we also had some other massive news with the International Criminal Court issuing a arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister, the former defense minister, and I think also Hamas's probably now deceased military chief. Here to keep us all up to date on that, I'm joined by Mihailo Zekic.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So, yeah, can you catch us up on that news?
Yeah, so today, as you mentioned, the International Criminal Court announced arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as Yoav Gallant, who, as we've talked about, I think a couple of weeks ago, until recently, was Israel's defense minister. Mohammed Dayef, the Hamas leader that you mentioned, Israel claimed to have killed him in July. The ICC says they haven't seen any evidence of that. They were also supposed to give warrants for Yahya Sinwar and Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's two other big fish that, of course, Israel had killed by now. But the emphasis, of course, for obvious reasons, is on the democratically elected prime minister of Israel and his defense minister, whom to this point most people saw as a moderating force in the war on Gaza. The two specific charges that the ICC are launching at those two are war crimes and crimes against humanity, mainly centered around their claim that those two men in leading the war effort have purposely, with malignant intent and systematically tried to stop aid like food and other vital supplies from getting into Gaza.
Using starvation as a weapon of warfare, I think is one of the terms.
Yes, exactly. In other words, basically enacting their own Holodomor in Gaza. First off, Israel's war effort is extremely well documented, and I mean the fact that you hear stories about like how much, like thousands and thousands of trucks entering in Israel or into Gaza to distribute aid. Like, Israel is not putting up a blockade on Gaza in a war zone, which you'd expect it to. Like, if it was, Ukraine's not trading with Russia right now. Like, North Korea and South Korea aren't trading, but Israel, because it's Israel, gets singled out for doing something that it's very demonstrably not doing.
Yeah, I think that, like, there's two, to me, looking at these accusations, you can get into the details and you can show how each detail is demonstrably false. And then you can look at the overall picture and also see that the overall picture that they're presenting is demonstrably false. So, you know, like, you mentioned the use of starvation and I think I've got the exact wording here where they accused Israel imposed a total siege over Gaza that involved completely closing the three border crossing points, Rafah, Kerem Shalom, and Eretz. I mean, that's a total lie. Like, these, okay, we can get into the minutiae, and that's not true. Egypt has controlled the Rafah crossing, not Israel. For the rest, Israel has actually had them open for most of the time that the International Criminal Court was writing, not closed. They, in fact, extended, and Hamas damaged one of the border crossings. They repaired it and extended it so they could get more supplies through. I think it was when the court made this statement, I've got it here, that they had 20,000 trucks carrying 400,000 tons of food had been traveled into Gaza through these crossings. So the court says Israel has imposed a policy of starvation, and the reality is that Israel has let in 400,000 tons of food. It's a total lie. And okay, they made these accusations back in the spring. All of these lies have all been pointed out, yet we've still come to this point where these judges have approved the arrest warrant.
It gets better. They're putting the term of from what date to what date when they're expecting these crimes to have been committed to October 8th last year. One day after the October 7th massacre, weeks before Israel even started their ground invasion. So in other words, the time for looking at when Israel is committing war crimes is literally the day after the invasion that they suffered started, before they even had a chance to respond to it. And Israel, for its part, it was it sent a few disputes, I don't know if that's the right word, but objections, there we go. It sent a few objections to the court on them going through with this, one of them being that Israel is not a party to the Rome Statute, which gives the court its legitimacy. And they said, but the state of Palestine is, even though a lot of the world doesn't recognize the state of Palestine, even though Gaza itself is not under jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority currently, which is supposedly the state of Palestine. And Israel also mentioned that they didn't receive enough advanced news from the court about what was going on, that they needed time to prepare their own defense, etc. And this is, I quote now from the press release that the court released today about their argument against this. Quote, the chamber also rejected Israel's request under Article 18.1 of the statute. The chamber recalled that the prosecution notified Israel of the initiation of an investigation in 2021.
Oh, before Gaza.
Yes! I mean, I'll have to look into a little bit more about what exactly that meant, but I mean, what do you mean 2021? That was before Netanyahu. I don't even think Netanyahu was in power at that, or he was just about to come into power. Gallant certainly wasn't in power then.
Yeah, that is, I mean, when you started that, I was like, okay, I'm not really interested in the legal minutiae, honestly, about who has jurisdiction, and I don't know, like, I'm more interested in moral right and wrong and people lying but the idea that 2021, like that they apparently notified Israel of this case before the Gaza war that this is all about started, that is pretty shocking. At best, that seems like a typo, but you'd have thought of something in this magnitude, they would have had a chance to iron out all of these typos or anything like that. But I think going back to things being wrong in the details and then wrong in the overall picture, like this overall picture that Israel is committing genocide, I think is just also so provably and demonstrably false. Like, again, I mean, you can look at the statistics. It's like people say so often, numbers don't care about your feelings, facts don't care about your feelings. Yes, you may be angry with Israel. That doesn't change the facts. And the facts are no other modern military has worked harder to avoid civilian casualties than Israel. No other country has achieved such a low civilian casualty rate for high-intensity urban warfare than Israel has. I mean, I think it was back in May when you first had they were pursuing an arrest warrant, and you took Hamas's own figures, and Israel was killing one civilian for every combatant. That is way lower than the casualty rate. Like, America was killing far more civilians per combatant when they were involved in Afghanistan and in Iraq when they were involved in the higher intensity fighting. Now, you'll see some statistics that then expand that out to more of the peacekeeping operation. And at that point, yeah, civilian casualties were lower because you don't have this high intensity warfare. So, yeah, this idea of genocide itself, the idea that Israel is committing genocide is, again, provably and demonstrably false. And yet this International Criminal Court, one of the most prestigious and highly regarded courts in the world, has gone ahead and made this accusation.
Indeed. And it puts Mr. Netanyahu in some ignoble company. Genocide is obviously, it's a very serious term. It's not like this court or any other international institution throws it around willy-nilly. Here's a couple of people that they have charged with it. Omar Bashir, you might recognize that name, the former dictator of Sudan that caused the Darfur crisis. And last year, Vladimir Putin, for his government's admitting to kidnapping thousands of Ukrainian children to send back to Russia. And
but then also who they've not, but then they've not gone after Bashar al-Assad. They've not gone after Khomeini. There are plenty of dictators that they haven't gone after.
Exactly. And if you look at the countries that are party to the statute, you notice that Iran's not a party, China's not a party, Turkey, Cuba, all these countries that normally these kinds of institutions are made to go after in the first place, they're not a member of it. But even though these countries, many of them have attacked member countries that are a party to this statute, we still don't see these kinds of charges being leveled up against them. But do you know who is a member? Even when the Taliban came in Afghanistan. To this point, since 2021, I think it was just about a month ago when somebody brought up a complaint to the ICC that the Taliban were doing illegal things under their view, even though they came to power again in 2021. And there's a lot of other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, like Mali. We've heard a lot recently about the coup there and some of the repercussions going on there. There's a lot of places that you'd think the ICC would have more of an interest in actually going to help people.
And I think that's the tragedy of this story is it hurts the ICC. This is going to hurt the ICC more than it hurts Israel. Because it's certainly there's already, I think the next Senate Majority Leader is tweeting out how outrageous this is. Rightly so, he's upset about this. And they're looking at America putting sanctions on the ICC. And this is what Israel's President Isaac Herzog said, tweeted, taken in bad faith, the outrageous decision at the ICC has turned a universal justice into a laughingstock. It makes a mockery of the sacrifice of all of those who fight for justice, from Allied victory over the Nazis till today. And he's right. And part of the reason why I'm upset about this is I do think the ICC is important and has a very important role to play in international relations and in the international community. We're going to have to keep this fairly tight because I have my international relations class to teach in 13 minutes. They do play a very important role. And Herbert W. Armstrong, who the ICC is a bit more of a recent invention, but he was really honored by the International Court of Justice. Many of their judges, there was a state dinner in his honor. He gave speeches there. He talked about the importance of using in the role that international law plays in the pursuit of world peace, and that if we're ever going to have world peace, it's got to have a basis in international law. And maybe I'll be able to read you a few quotes from that in a minute. So, this damages this push. This kind of idea of we're going to have courts that are going to uphold international law came about after World War II, and it came about to prevent Nazi atrocities from ever happening again. Now, if you were to apply the logic that the ICC used in this case, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt would be now being pursued for arrest warrants under the ICC. Now, probably this ICC wouldn't do that because Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt aren't Jewish. And I think it's quite clear they're applying one standard to Jewish leaders and another to everybody else. But that shows how damaged this court has become. This thing that we need for international relations that is meant to be doing a good thing of upholding international law has decided to throw law and facts and truth out the window to instead go after their own vendettas and biases.
Indeed. Now, moving forward, it's one thing to say, okay, some judge that doesn't even represent their own country's government signs a piece of paper. What does that mean? Well, going forward, this means that the 125 state parties of the Rome Statute now have an obligation to arrest Netanyahu and arrest Gallant if they ever travel to those countries. Again, as I mentioned, that leaves out quite a few more shall we say, perennial perpetrators of some of these international laws. It also doesn't include the United States, Netanyahu's most important ally. So he does have a bit of silver lining there. But if you ever want to travel anywhere in the European Union, almost every country in Latin America, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, South Africa, Jordan, its neighbor, they all have an obligation to extradite Netanyahu and Gallant to The Hague.
And I think, again, this is where it probably hurts the ICC more than it hurts Netanyahu. He can still travel to the United States. It would not surprise me if we start to see more and more countries just ignoring the ICC, the way that they have with Vladimir Putin, not doing what it says.
Mm-hmm. And even there is a bit of silver lining in Israeli domestic politics.
Are they all rallied around him?
Yeah. Obviously, his coalition is rallying around. So the president, Isaac Herzog, he belongs to the Labour Party. He's slamming the ICC. Benny Gantz, the main opposition figure in the Knesset against Netanyahu. He's also slammed this. Gallant, for his part, we've talked before a couple of weeks ago about how his firing was pretty controversial in Israel, but now that his name's still on the ticket, that's probably going to be all smoothed away. And again, when you're indicting the prime minister and the defense minister, you're, by extension, maybe not on the piece of paper, but you're blaming the entire army and, by extent, the entire war effort, which includes the civilian society in this case.
I mean, that I think is the bigger, is where there is a big genuine danger to Israel, is if then this starts to become pursuing individual members of the IDF through the courts.
That's true. The ICC hasn't really done that so much except for low-hanging fruit, like, say, people captured from Syria and sent over, or like African countries that have been overthrown. But in regards to the Israeli populace themselves, we were starting to see coming up to now a lot of those old tensions, like the anti-Netanyahu, we need to get rid of Bibi at all costs, bubbling up. I think this is going to smooth things over for a bit, and this is going to help him out, at least domestically.
But certainly internationally, you do then, that's a good point as well in the domestic scene. But internationally, so earlier today we pre-recorded our Trumpet World Week in Review segment for the Middle East to go out tomorrow. Just with the scheduling, we often record on Wednesday. It gives George more time to do editing and post-production. And we were talking, when the ICC thing came out, it's like, great, okay, we've got to re-record. We've got to do more on the big news. And it was like, well, how do we fit this in with our schedules? Well, actually doing a live show so that we can get the latest commentary on this seems the way to go. But this morning, we were talking about the Pope's comments. And I think you made an really interesting point in some of our discussions after then. Do you want to just summarize a little briefly what we talked about this morning with the Pope's comments from his book over the weekend and how this may tie into this story?
Of course. Well, on November 19th, Pope Francis's autobiography, well, I guess it's more of a him being interviewed by a journalist and these interviews being mashed together in a compilation. It was released in Italian and Spanish, and obviously the Pope is a very important international figure. He obviously has a lot on his mind.
That's not the most insightful thing you've ever said on this show, by the way.
The Pope, is the Pope Catholic?
Yeah, good question. Sorry, go on.
Well, anyway, he's obviously has a lot more on his mind than just, say, feeding the poor or like the typical topics that most leaders of churches talk about. And in this case, he brought up the wars in the Middle East. There was a relevant excerpt that was leaked to the Italian publication La Stampa. And this is what it says, quote, "According to some experts, what is happening in Gaza has the characteristics of a genocide. It should be carefully investigated to determine whether it fits into the technical definition formulated by jurists and international bodies," end quote. The Pope said a lot of negative things about Israel in the past. This is probably the most blatant and accusatory of them. What international bodies is he talking about? There's only two main ones at least, that are looking at Netanyahu and Israel: the ICC and the World Court affiliated with the UN, which is tiptoeing a bit more, but we have to cover this because there's a lot of countries on our back, but we don't want to make everyone else mad either. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but you look up until this time, there's been very much silence among most world leaders, including Joe Biden, who's had a lot of things to say about Netanyahu, about the ICC, and more criticism than anything from most world leaders. Pope Francis is probably the first biggie, at least in the Western world, to say anything about this. You mentioned Vladimir Putin before. The judges took 23 days to decide that he was guilty of everything that was going on. They took 6 months for Israel. People were wondering, why is it taking so long? The Pope comes, says this, and then a few days later, you get this ruling from an international body that's based in his home turf of Europe, of course. Whether this has anything to do with it, it's too early to say, but I think that at very least it is a very, very intriguing coincidence.
And like we talked about we talked this morning, we made the point, or you might have done, that he hasn't talked this way about the Ukrainian war. There are a lot of Ukrainian Catholics actually very frustrated that he won't speak out about allegations of Russian genocide in Ukraine. I think there's one pretty oblique statement that he has made about China and their genocide and what's happening with the Uyghurs.
You haven't even heard this much about Hezbollah, that Israel's also fighting, even though they have a way bigger Catholic population.
Right. So there's something, the Pope is focused on Israel in an unusual way. I think you also mentioned something I didn't realize on this morning, where you talked about how he's talking to
The main Catholic leader of the one congregation that they have in Gaza has roughly 600 people every day at 7 p.m. his time.
So, I mean, you think about how hard it is for a world leader to get an audience with the Pope. He's talking to that guy every day. So he knows the facts, yet he misrepresents them. He makes these baseless accusations of genocide in this quote. And what we talked about in that show is that the Catholic Church has its own agenda in the Middle East. And we have our article, As You Watch Germany, Watch Gaza, which I am just trying to, here we go, get on the, there we go. You can stick that up now, George. As You Watch Gaza, Watch Germany, where Mr. Flurry goes through a lot of the analysis that we talked about this morning, that the Catholic Church has its own interests, its own agenda with what is happening in the Middle East, that even before October 7th, they were calling for some kind of international governance over Jerusalem. They have an unusual focus there. And that article goes on, and we might just even post, perhaps as just a shorter video clip, what we talked about this morning, rather than just throwing it in the dustbin because it's kind of out of date. But we talked about the way that you've got this power rising in Europe. Israel thinks that it can trust it, that it can look to it. I mean, you've got an article in the upcoming Trumpet print about even the role that potentially Europe and some of its Middle Eastern allies could play in the post-Gaza reconstruction. So Israel trusts Europe, but you look at what the Pope, who speaks for all these Catholics, is saying, and has been saying for the last 10 years. I mean, on that show, you went back to some things from 2014 and his trip to Jerusalem. There are some deeply, deeply worrying things going on there. So Europe, there's a lot of growing animosity to Israel all around the world that they really need to be aware of. That's going to make their life harder. I just wanted to touch on again Mr. Armstrong and his interactions with the international court system, where he attended the first United Nations summit in 1945, where he said there can be no real peace until we have justice for all. And he talked about, well, there's laws that cause peace. And if there's injustice, someone is breaking the law. Until that is rectified, there can't be peace. But, that statement, there can be no real peace until we have justice for all. The International Criminal Court's statements are a concern for all. This is dangerous for all. And he talked about an International Court of Justice that was visiting him, visiting his college. He said he and I are in agreement in principle on what it will take to bring world peace. In his lectures, he said 2 ingredients are basic: law and authority. Law without authority would be flouted and produce anarchy. Authority without law would be despotism and tyranny. Yet now, this is a court that is ultimately protecting Hamas, making it easier for the bad guys, easier for the people that are really violating all law and justice. And this is the organizations, the United Nations. We had some more news this morning from the United Nations where there was photos of UNRWA, I think, getting together with Hamas, and I think it was 2017. And they're meeting with and coordinating things with Hamas. Like all of these organizations, United Nations, International Criminal Court, that are designed to bring about world peace, are failing horribly. And that's not just a problem if you're a Jew. That is a problem for everyone. It ties right in with that first use of the international or the intercontinental ballistic missile that we saw last night as well. Like, this is what is there to bring world peace and to solve the problem of nuclear war. And instead, they are causes now of much more and much greater injustice.
Indeed. I think the ICC is obviously not affiliated with the UN, but I think it's interesting that you mentioned these institutions coming together to make sure what happened with Nazism doesn't happen again. And you fast forward 70 years, 80 years, and we've come full circle. Now the targets of the Nazis are being targeted themselves by these institutions, even though a year ago they experienced the same kind of atrocities. It's a point that you go to often in some of the material produced, that Mr. Gerald Fleury, our editor-in-chief, goes to often when looking at situations like this, is that there is no help in man. that no matter man's best efforts, no matter even if it has the most surest footing, 125 countries coming together agreeing we need one standard for all of us and we're going to uphold the law, and this is the end result. No matter what, and I mean, every time there's a global crisis, it seems like we have this discussion again after Napoleon was defeated, after World War I, everyone says, okay, we're serious this time, we're going to come together and create peace. And the next even bigger world crisis is the result.
Yeah, we've had this long track record of failure, and that is one of the big lessons. There's no help in God. And, I'm sorry, no help in man. Thank you. Yes, want to get that straight. We also concluded this morning, we were talking about that there is, God's prophecies is very specific. And we'll talk with Jeremiah more about the intercontinental ballistic missile. But we've been saying all week, what's happening in Ukraine is not going to lead to World War III. Like, God says that there's going to be no help in man, but he spells out the end, and he spells out all of the details and how it's going to happen to show us that there is hope in God, and that all of this is happening according to his plan. And I think we'll get into some of the other details of that on this kind of second part of our show when we get into that later. Before we conclude this Middle East bit, though, were there any other Middle Eastern stories you wanted to give us a very quick rundown of?
Yes, well, for obvious reasons, as I'm preparing for this, I don't have the latest update on this, but the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany have decided to censure Iran at the International Atomic Energy Agency. That's like the one international institution I have some support with because they do try to do a good job, but they're always hamstrung in the fact that no one gives them any authority to carry out their mandate. But anyway, Iran obviously has been flouting a lot of the provisions trying to stop it from getting a nuclear bomb. If this once the censure goes through, it could trigger a vote, which, if that passes with the IAEA's members, it means we could get a more comprehensive investigation into the open questions Iran isn't answering, as well as potentially even some of those sanctions that were lifted against Iran on the international sphere when the JCPOA in 2016 came into effect. So the vote could happen. Some people are speculating today. We'll wait and see what happens with that. And also, Spiegel earlier this week wrote an article, or published an article, claiming that the Association of German Ship Owners had been for months receiving threatening emails from the Houthis, the rebel group in Yemen, that they need to leave, not even just not sail through the Red Sea, but don't dock at any Israel port, or else your ships are fair game. And of course, the Ship Owners Association sent that all the information to the German Navy, as you would expect. And I'm sure the Houthis knew that too. We're seeing Germany get more and more involved in the Middle East. Last month, I believe, they might have been even earlier this month, the German frigate shot down a drone that was flying in from Lebanon by Hezbollah to Israel. And I think the Houthis are trying to do a bit of saber rattling as preventative measures to stop Germany from maybe taking more an interest in Yemen as well. But either way, we're seeing Germany get more and more interested in the Middle East, as we just talked about, and we're going to see Germany start to become a more important player in this as well.
That is an important story to keep an eye on, and when we do the second part, we'll talk about how Europe is being transformed by this war with Ukraine, and I think the fact that it's happening while Germany is leaderless, you're getting this pressure from them in the Middle East, pressure from Russia. That is really going to pressure some change in Germany. Well, thank you so much for that, Mihailo. I'll just leave you, we've mentioned a few bits, a few articles. I'll just leave you with a quick plug for Herbert W. Armstrong's book, The United States and Britain in Prophecy. We kind of ended by talking about God rules in the kingdom of men. God has a plan in the midst of all of these chaotic and rather frightening world events. And that book is a great introduction to exactly what that plan is. And you can read that online. You can order your own free print copy at our website, thetrumpet.com. Thank you so much for joining us, especially to those that kind of hopped on live as we did this impromptu live session. Really appreciate your company. I've got to run, but we will be back. We'll be releasing a second part, maybe even live again tomorrow. We'll try and keep you posted about that. And until then, keep watching your world.